Hey people, Pranksterman here. I'm going to do a quick video on how to hook up an alternator, specifically a CS130 alternator. This will also apply to a CS121, which is a smaller version of what I'm about to show you, and a CS144 alternator, which is the bigger case version of this alternator. Here we have a CS130. This came out of a 91 Cutlass Supreme front wheel drive. If you notice, it is a 6G pulley on there. And if you notice the front, the bracket holes there's the main bottom, which is at 6 o'clock, and then the side bracket, which is at 2 o'clock. They make different brackets for different applications. You might have one where this bracket would be here or here on the alternator, which is 10 o'clock, 12 o'clock, and 2 o'clock. Plus at 12 o'clock, different lengths. The hole might be here, the hole might be here, and the hole might be here, depending on your application and the bracket system that's on the vehicle. 6-groove pulley. These normally either have a 5G or a 6G pulley. You can unbolt the pulley, and a standard V-belt pulley will fit right on here from an older alternator with no problem. It's a universal shaft. You can get one off of an older Ford alternator or a older GM alternator, like a 10SI or a 12SI should have a single groove pulley. Whatever your preference is, different size pulleys, or whatever you could find in a single G. That way you could hook it up to a riding mower or whatever. If you notice, the case, now what builders do, they would build the alternator, the back half with the rotor in it, and throw that part on the shelf, and depending on the application, they would put the front on when needed. They do this because all the backs are the same no matter what. Same regulators, same hookups. As mentioned earlier, for the 121, this is a 130, and then the 144, which is the bigger case. The wiring, well, the regulator would be the same for all of them, which means the wiring going to it would be used from one alternator to another, or they're all the same hookups. In other words, if you notice on the back has, this is the charging wire. This wire goes to the battery, which should be at least a 10 gauge or higher, or thicker wire, I'm sorry. You want a 10 gauge or thicker wire because these alternators are pretty high output. This one is a 105 amp, which is the highest for this case. You can get a custom built one up to 140 amps or 160 amps. The CS144s, which is the bigger case, you could get those up to 200 amps, but who's going to use 200 amps on a riding mower? Plus the smaller cases, that would be more to the liking to putting on to a riding mower if you wanted to. Lighter, smaller, it would have the same hookups, so what I'm about to tell you about the wiring would apply to that alternator too. Like I said before, the rotor along with the back half, they're all the same. So if you find an alternator that has a different front on there, it's not going to matter. Just worry about bolting it in. but the wire hookups will be the same for the alternator. If you look at the plug has 4 prongs sticking out of it. I'll go through which prong does what in a minute. These alternators are a pretty good alternator. They go on fuel injected cars because fuel injected cars needs a lot more power, but these alternators have a problem at very low RPMs. The alternator will turn on, but it won't put out any amperage when they're spinning real slow as compared to a 10 SI. A 10 SI will put out some kind of power, but these alternators will turn on, but they will put out nothing. You have to spin it above a certain RPM. I think the magic RPM for these things to turn on and put out the bare minimum would be about 600 RPMs on the tachometer of the engine, which would be 2 to 1, about 1200 RPM rotor speed. 1200 to 1800 RPMs rotor speed. So it would be a good idea to find the smallest pulley you can for these alternators, and then have at least a 2 to 1 ratio to drive this alternator for it to put out something at idle. If you're going to be revving the engine when you're using it, then you wouldn't have to worry about a smaller pulley. Any kind of pulley would work. Okay, let's get to the plug. Okay, let's talk about the wiring and the plug in these alternators. The plug, if you look down inside of it, has 4 prongs in there. You'll notice that on the right side, this side, you'll notice that prong is bigger than the others and it's spaced out a little more. Keep that in mind when I explain the plugs. When you're looking at the prongs, the prongs from left to right do certain things, and I'll describe them. From far left would be an auxiliary hookup. You would probably never use that, don't worry about it. The second one from the left would be for the light on the dashboard. The next prong would be for turning the alternator on and off. That would be the field wire. And the one on the far right, that would be voltage sensing. Okay. Okay, I just got done describing the plug in the alternator. Really doesn't matter. It's the plug you're worried about. The plug is where all the magic happens. Now, to get this alternator to work right depends on the plug. The plug has different variations. It might have 1 wire, 2 wire, or 3 wires coming out of it. On a car or a light truck, you probably wouldn't find one that has 4 wires, but if you do find one, I would stay away from that kind of plug. So you're worried about the 1 wire, 2 wire, and 3 wire plugs that clip into the regulator. This is where the magic happens. Like I said, if you find a plug that has 1 wire, then inside the plug is going to have crossovers and resistors built into the plug to get the alternator to work right, which would be the best hookup if you just have 1 wire. So keep an eye out for them. Most cars usually have about 2 wires working the alternator. It would be the 2 center prongs on the plug, or 2 brown wires. I have one vehicle in the yard that has 2 wires in the plug. I'll show you that when I get done here. Now if you find a plug that has 3 wires, you would have to hook up all 3 wires to get the alternator to work right. So the best bet would be to look around and find a plug that just has 1 wire coming out of it. And when I get done here, I'll show you my car, and then at the end of the video I'll show wiring diagrams of how to hook up these alternators using the plug, and there's lettering on the plug right above the wires going into it. So I'll draw a picture and put it at the end of the video. Okay, we're at the car. We're looking at the alternator that's bolted in, and you notice the plug has 2 wires in it. If I could get the light right, maybe you could see the lettering on it. The lettering would be right above the wire going into the plug. Since this plug has 2 wires, that's how you need to run this alternator in this vehicle with this wiring harness. This is where the magic happens inside the plug. If you have a plug that has 3 wires, then you would need to hook up all 3 wires. If you have a plug that has 1 wire, then you only need to hook up the plug that has the 1 wire coming out of it to work the alternator. How they do it is inside the plug they have the wires jumped around to make the plug work the alternator in different applications. So if you find a plug with 1 wire, then you just have 1 wire to hook up. And in this case there's 2 wires going to the alternator. If you pull this alternator out and you use this plug, you would only have to worry about hooking up 2 wires. Okay, the wires going into the plug have lettering right above it. The lettering from left to right would be PLFS, and we'll get to that later, what these letters mean and the wires that go in there and how you read them. Okay. Bye. Okay, I just got done explaining details of these alternators and how to hook them up. They're a pretty good alternator. To hook them up to a riding mower would be pretty cool. Pretty new alternator. Straightforward design, but they're hard to work on. Those things are soldered together on the inside, and it's hard to fix them if something goes bad. And those alternators are prone to the rear bearing blowing out. So if you get one, you spin the rotor and it squeaks in the back, I'd probably stay away from it. The back bearing's drying up and ready to blow. So rate the video, comment, subscribe. Pranks the man. Bye.